Yeah. Welcome to The Legacy of the American Revolution, a summer lecture series hosted by the Platypus Affiliated Society. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s to 70s, and post-political 1980s to 90s left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. In these times, we are hosting a number of online activities, such as this lecture series and chapter-based reading groups. To find out how to join an online reading group, go to platypus1917.org/virtual. We also publish a monthly open submission journal, the Platypus Review. The latest issue, number 128, is online now, so check it out. If you would like to submit an article to the Platypus Review, please send an email to editor@platypus1917.org. You can also check out our podcast, Shit Platypus Says, for your dose of the commentary on the left, which is published regularly on SoundCloud and Apple Podcasts. Please share, subscribe, and give us a review. Today's discussion on the Gilded Age is part of a continuing series on the American Revolution. The presidential election raises questions about the revolutionary character of the United States every 4 years. This year is no different, but certainly the mass protests against police brutality and the toppling of statues, including those of revolutionary figures around America that have happened to coincide with this lecture series, call for us to revisit the history of the American Revolution and its continuing legacy. The red thread running through the lecture series is the persistence and legacy of the revolution. We ask, how does America remain a revolutionary society? How did each chapter of American history give a new impetus to the revolution that began in 1776? Our approach to the American Revolution and the subsequent history of the polity it founded is from the perspective of the bourgeois revolution and its crisis in the Marxist philosophy of history, capitalism. I have the great pleasure today to introduce our lecturer, Chris Cutrone. Chris Cutrone teaches Frankfurt School Critical Theory at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and the Institute for Clinical Social Work. He is the original lead organizer, former president, and chief pedagogue of the Platypus Affiliated Society. Chris Cutrone delivered a lecture on Thomas Jefferson as part of this series, which can be found on our YouTube page. He is also the author of an article published in the most recent issue of the Platypus Review titled Republicans and Riots, The Left in Death, 1992 and 2020. He quit the left in 1993. He is the last Marxist and your track coach. We are going to take questions through the Q&A box after Chris's lecture. You may also raise your hand if you would like to be recognized to give your question or comment live, and you can find the button to do that at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, I will let Chris begin.
Thanks, Erin. So I'd like to preface my lecture with some remarks on the series of lectures we've been doing on the legacy of the American Revolution thus far. To at least articulate for myself what I think the purpose of the lectures is. So Platypus, of course, says the left is dead, long live the left. And that is not simply an opinion, it's a historical evaluation of where the present is with respect to the history of Marxism, the historical past. And not just of Marxism, but also the history of modern society and of capitalism. Several years back at the Left Forum in New York City, we held a panel on Revolution Without Marx, Rousseau and his followers for the left, in which myself and Spencer Leonard and Sunit Singh gave presentations on Rousseau, Adam Smith, Kant, Hegel, and Nietzsche. And so the idea there was what would be the understanding of revolution in the modern era and modern society as revolutionary without Marxism, without Marx and without Marxism. What would happen to our conception of that? I've approached this lecture series, at least my contributions to it, keeping in the back of my mind the same kind of question, the same kind of problem, which is what does revolutionary politics look like in terms of its history and also its legacy and its potential future if Marxism is removed from the equation. So when Platypus says the left is dead, long live the left, what we have in mind is Marxism. Marxism is dead, long live Marxism. So if we were hypothetically to say Marxism is a done deal, it's finished, it's over, it's in the past, and it is dead, doesn't have a future, then what would the American Revolution look like from such a perspective? So it's actually meant to reverse what might otherwise be the assumed standpoint of this lecture series. So we might assume, because Platypus is interested in Marxism, and for instance, I call myself somewhat humorously the last Marxist, that we are looking at the American Revolution and its legacy from the standpoint of Marxism. We are trying to bring a Marxist perspective on the American Revolution and its legacy for us today. In fact, I think that we are doing the opposite of that. Namely, we are laying the groundwork for evaluating Marxism from the standpoint of the American Revolution, meaning from the perspective of the American Revolution, the society that it engendered all the way up to today, and its legacy. What is Marxism from that perspective? What does Marxism mean from that perspective? And I'm motivated to approach things that way. From consideration of a major historical figure in American Marxism, Eugene Debs. In other words, why would Eugene Debs, a labor militant activist, have become a Marxist? So why would an American become specifically a Marxist, not just a socialist, but a Marxist? What did Marxism mean to an American radical labor militant and socialist like Eugene Debs? How did it make sense from his perspective? So you'll see that the readings that I've recommended for my lecture today are very sparse, very few and far between, and they are mostly writings of Eugene Debs, where he refers to the meaning of the American Revolution to him as a socialist and as a Marxist. So that's the spirit with which I've been approaching my contribution to the lecture series, and that I think bears keeping in mind for the entire lecture series, that we are not saying, how do we evaluate the American Revolution and its legacy from the standpoint of Marxism, but rather, how do we evaluate Marxism from the standpoint of the American Revolution and its legacy? John F. Kennedy, when he was running for president in 1960, gave a speech in Harlem at the Hotel Teresa, in which he claimed 20th century revolution for the legacy of the American Revolution. He said we should not fear the revolution going on around us in the 20th century, because after all, it is the descendant and offspring and part of, he said, it's actually part of the American Revolution, the ongoing effect and history and legacy and ongoing task of the American Revolution. And in fact, what he posed, and we can consider the meaning, why he posed it that way. He was actually running against Richard Nixon, who had been Eisenhower's vice president, on a Cold War basis, meaning John F. Kennedy was running as more of a Cold War hawk, as against what he accused the Eisenhower and Nixon administration of dithering with respect to the Cold War, especially over the loss of Cuba, the Cuban Revolution. He was saying, we should not cede, we should not concede revolutionary politics to the Soviet Union and to the East Bloc more generally, but rather in the competition of the Cold War, the United States should claim the mantle of revolution. In other words, the United States should claim and should pose as the true upholder of the revolutionary tradition as against the East Bloc and the Soviet Union. So of course, I'm not arguing that is not my perspective. Nonetheless, it's remarkable that that was part of mainstream political discourse during the Cold War, that really the conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States in the Cold War was over which country represented the true revolutionary tradition and true legacy of modern revolutionary politics. So that's worth bearing in mind. So in this respect, again, it's not that the American Revolution must pass muster before the judgment of Marxism, but rather Marxism must pass muster before the judgment of the American Revolution and its legacy. Otherwise, there really is no future for the struggle for socialism in the United States, or really anywhere in the world, meaning if the struggle for socialism is based on a condemnation of the American Revolution and its legacy, it's hopeless. It is hopeless. And so if Marxism cannot pass muster before the judgment of the revolution, namely the bourgeois revolution of the last several hundred years that has continued to unfold throughout the world, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, liberty, equality, and fraternity, those values, if socialism and Marxism cannot pass judgment before those values, then it really is doomed. It has no future whatsoever. And indeed, because it's dead as a politics today, we could say Marxism has already failed in that respect. And so the question is, can it experience a rebirth? Well, if it can't experience a rebirth according to those values, then it really can't experience a rebirth at all. So with respect to Platypus's motto or slogan, the left is dead, long live the left, long live the left, long live Marxism, is predicated on the idea that the revolutionary tradition of which Marxism was always part is not over, is not dead, and certainly is not opposed by Marxism. Okay, so that is one preamble I wanted to make to my lecture today. My lecture today is going to be based on an article that I wrote and published several years ago in the December 2017, January 2018 issue of the Platypus Review, issue 102 of the Platypus Review. The End of the Gilded Age, Discontents of the Second Industrial Revolution Today. I wanted to say something to link up the Gilded Age era of American history, and specifically American socialism emerging as a mass political phenomenon in that period, to link that up with the preceding lecture on the Civil War and Reconstruction, and emphasize something that I don't in the article on which I'm going to base my lecture today. Namely, the brutality of the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age sounds like a euphemism. So it was a term coined by Mark Twain to condemn the gilded, superficial quality of the prosperity of the United States and really of global capitalism during the era of the Second Industrial Revolution. In other words, it was gilded on the outside, but on the inside, there was a much uglier reality. And so, drawing from the last lecture on the Civil War and on Reconstruction and the failure of Reconstruction in the United States, I wanted to emphasize something, which is a condition that was faced in the American South and by Black Americans in particular after emancipation in the ongoing history of capitalism, namely a condition that historians have called worse than slavery. Worse than slavery. There's actually a book called Worse Than Slavery on this precise phenomenon. Namely, slavery was abolished, but it was replaced in large measure by forced labor. For instance, prison labor, the infamous chain gang labor. And this is from the very beginning. And in fact, more recently, some people have taken issue with the conditions of the 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery. Namely, that forced labor, slavery, compulsory labor is abolished, except with the exception of prison labor. And that exception is actually quite important. So the brutality of prison labor in the American South, but really throughout the United States, in the post-Reconstruction era, in this Gilded Age era of the Second Industrial Revolution in the United States, is that people would be arrested on the flimsiest pretexts and given what might sound like a light sentence, for instance, a sentence of 3 or 4 years. But routinely, they would be worked to death in prison labor before their sentence was up. That was a mass reality in the United States in this period of burgeoning American capitalism in the post-Civil War era. That's what the rapid industrialization of the United States looked like, at least in its worst excesses in this period. So I'm not going to be emphasizing that aspect of Second Industrial Revolution or Gilded Age capitalism in my lecture. However, it's something worth bearing in mind. Namely that emancipation from slavery did not establish bourgeois rights for labor for the emancipated slaves, for Black Americans. And not only as a function of eventual de jure segregation, certainly racist terror, KKK terror, and we know the very dramatic examples of this kind of regime that existed in the American South, but not only in the American South, throughout the United States, lynching. So it's not that Black Americans were emancipated from slavery, enjoyed the status of free laborers, except for some racist excesses of violence, dramatic racist excesses of violence directed against them, and legal discrimination imposed upon them. But actually, it's even worse than that. Namely that there was at least a significant portion, certainly not a majority, but a significant portion of capitalist labor post-slavery that was imposed as forced labor under the pretext of convict labor, prison labor. Because again, a lot of this was really prosecution and arrest, imprisonment for crimes on the flimsiest pretext. And we can talk about other aspects of American capitalism in the post-Reconstruction era that are similarly brutal. So we should bear in mind that this era of rapid industrialization of the United States that I'm going to be addressing now, that gave rise to the American Socialist movement, is a particularly brutal period in the history of global capitalism, not just American capitalism, although it's very important in considering American history. Okay, so now I'm going to read from my article on the end of the Gilded Age, and also elaborate on some points along the way that bear some underscoring and some further fleshing out. The account of history is the theory of the present. How did we get here? And what tasks remain from the past that, however, appear to be new today? As Adorno put it, Theodore Adorno from the Frankfurt School, the new is the old in distress. This is true of capitalism and its crisis now. The present crisis is a crisis of the world system of capitalism that emerged in the 20th century. A crisis of the capitalist world created by the Second Industrial Revolution at the end of the 19th century. In fits and starts, such as the two world wars and the Cold War, but nonetheless consistently and inexorably. That system has been led by the countries newly industrialized at the end of the 19th century, the United States, Germany, and Japan. All three have come to be in crisis in the early 21st century. The crisis of the EU, for example, can be regarded as a crisis of the management of German capital. David Harvey, in his book The Condition of Postmodernity from 1990, written and published in the heyday of neoliberalism, regarded the history of capitalism as a succession of regimes of accumulation. Concrete forms for socially and politically mediating the need to accumulate capital in its valorization process. But since, according to Marxism, capitalism is itself a form of social contradiction, and thus a crisis and decay of society and politics, each successive form of capitalism takes up and perpetuates the crisis of the preceding form, however, in an altered way. Capitalism really is a matter of kicking the can down the road, apparently indefinitely. But the banging can eventually returns, and we must ultimately pay the added costs of its deferral. The characterization by critical contemporaries of late 19th and early 20th century era capitalism as the Gilded Age expressed its quality as what Immanuel Kant warned about a century earlier in his 1784 essay on the idea for universal history from a cosmopolitan point of view, namely, the danger that the vitality of mankind may go to sleep. He said, "Everything good that is not based on a morally good disposition, however, is nothing but pretense and glittering misery." Gilded Age capitalism was such glittering misery. This quality of capitalism continues today, especially in the last generation of neoliberalism whose spell was broken in the recent crisis. Joseph Schumpeter, a mid-20th century liberal, tried to put a happy face on capitalism by calling it creative destruction. But Marxism recognized to the contrary that it is actually destructive creation. And its destructiveness is not only immediate, but has long-term consequences. The destruction of capitalism is cumulative. It makes claims on future generations that cannot be settled cheaply. It was during the period of the late 19th century Gilded Age that capitalists appeared not as entrepreneurs of production, but as robber barons, an aristocracy of looting. Marx had already mordantly observed that in industrial production, with its high capital requirements, it was not the case that being a captain of industry made you money, but rather that having money made you a captain of industry. In industrial capitalism, it was not, as Adam Smith had thought, production developed by reinvestment of relatively low profits in the long run, with high wages facilitating increased consumption, wealth, in a virtuous cycle, but rather as marginal utility theory, developed precisely in this late 19th century era, regarded more cynically that use values of commodities decrease over time, so investors in their production better get in early and take their profits out while the going is still good, and before it becomes a matter of diminishing returns. The miserable reasoning of what Smith regarded as mercantile interest, the profiteering of buying cheap and selling dear, that he thought actually constrains and undermines the productivity of wealth in society, and so needed to be overcome as an impediment to growth. Marx pursued rather the self-contradiction in what became of Smith's labor theory of value in industrial capitalism. The accelerated technical production of the Industrial Revolution increased, along with it, the accumulation and concentration of capital, which Marx thought produced a crisis of value in industrial capitalism, in that such production was still socially mediated by the value of wage labor, however anachronistically. Wage labor was inadequate for the social appropriation of industrial production. This was the self-contradiction of the capitalist mode of production in political economic terms, according to Marx. The bourgeois social relations were contradicted by the industrial forces of production. Industrial technique served to increase capital, but this outstripped the actual social productivity of human labor. Eliminating workers from production so that, as Max Horkheimer, the director of the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, wryly observed, quote, machines have made not work, but the workers superfluous. Adam Smith's proprietors of stock were only a slight variation on the prior traveling merchants collecting the goods, the products of cottage industry, now gathering the previously disparate producers and factories. They were not capitalists in the Marxist sense of owners of the means of production. The role of the proprietors in Smith's view of production was minimal by comparison to the laborers who were actually making things with increased efficiency, whereas Smith would have expected higher productivity to result in the increased value of time in work through cooperation that would not only increase the purchasing power of labor, but also decrease labor time and increase leisure time. What happened for labor instead, at a societal level, was that the pernicious combination of overwork and unemployment, not attributable merely to temporary labor market corrections. Human labor was progressively eliminated from production in absolute and not only relative terms. Increased production was no longer based primarily on human labor power, inputs in the efficient cooperation, as in Adam Smith's example of the pin factory, but rather on the development of science and technology, or what Marx called the general social intellect objectified in machine production. The combined and uneven, that is, self-contradictory development of capitalism is exhibited by the paradoxical phenomena of simultaneously coexisting robots and sweatshops. Industrial development and the accumulation of capital undermine the entire bourgeois social ethos of rewarding productivity through work, the exchange of labor as a commodity. Contrary to Smith's expectation, Marx observed how in capitalism, labor sinks from the most precious to the most wretched of commodities. The workers are expropriated of the value of their labor at a societal level, and not merely through being super exploited by their employers. There is a glaring problem in the development of wealth in society based on the value of labor. The ramifications of this are found in capitalism's social effects. This is what makes capitalists appear ambiguously, as performing a social duty as investors, but also as criminals ripping off society. What Adam Smith had warned about, the constant danger of their conspiracy against the public. Bernard Mandeville's 1714 book, The Fable of the Bees, a parable of private vices and public benefits, seemed mocked by what was actually happening in the Gilded Age. Were the capitalists really, as today's parlance goes, job creators? Yes and no, as often as not. When President Theodore Roosevelt went after J.P. Morgan for violation of antitrust laws, Morgan, a Republican Party supporter, complained, asking what he could do to avoid prosecution by the government. Roosevelt replied with a variation of Robespierre's injunction that if someone feels implicated by the gaze of judgment, it is because he is guilty. Who wouldn't side with Roosevelt's sentiment against the robber baron? But Roosevelt was motivated not by altruism, but by what he regarded as necessary policy to make capitalists responsible investors. Build the railroads, just don't rip us off. Marx thought that socialism would allow industrial production to go beyond capital and overcome the need for and value of labor in a socially beneficial and not destructive way. This was a problem of society, not reducible to the criminality of individual capitalists. Even Roosevelt recognized the need for a change in policy beyond the mere curbing of excesses. For Marxism, the accumulation of capital in industrial production was a crisis for bourgeois society, but also an opportunity for changing it. Indeed, realizing the social potential of capitalism was a necessity, task. It was, to use their language, inevitable. The only question was the depth and breadth of the needed change in society. In the 20th century, the discontents of Gilded Age capitalism of the Second Industrial Revolution led to what David Harvey, after Antonio Gramsci, called Fordism, a new regime of accumulation or concrete form for the valorization process of capital. It was a new and different form of production and consumption, a new economics and new politics, a new culture, a new way of life. The 20th century and its continuing legacy today express unresolved problems inherited from Gilded Age capitalism that Fordist capital was not able to overcome. We suffer today from discontents with the results, not, for instance, of the 16th to 18th century African slave trade, or the 15th century Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula and New World discovery, the Columbian discovery. We don't suffer from that, but rather from, for example, the failure of Reconstruction in the United States, and from the late second wave colonialism from the era of what Marxists called imperialism at the end of the 19th century. So the scramble for Africa, for example. Hence the problem of so-called neocolonialism. We live in the world created by the early 20th century's attempts to solve those problems that emerged in the Gilded Age. Eric Hobsbawm, a British communist historian, wrote of the long 19th and short 20th centuries. He regarded 1789 to 1914, the French Revolution to World War I, as one cycle, and he regarded 1914 to 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union, as another. But perhaps we should consider the short 19th century, the core of which runs from the 1820s to the 1870s, from the aftermath of the French Revolution until the US Civil War, the Meiji Restoration, and the Franco-Prussian War. And we should consider rather the long 20th century, which began perhaps as early as the 1870s, but certainly by the 1890s, and continued until the recent crisis of the 2000s to 2010s. The high 19th century of liberalism contrasts with the 20th century of state capitalism. In the 1990s, it seems as if, after the long detour of fascism and communism, Stalinism, in the 20th century, a responsibly reformed progressive capitalism of the Second Industrial Revolution would finally have its unobstructed day in the sun. The US, Germany, and Japan could inherit a progressively productive world at peace. This was the 1990s Clinton era. The mirage of the purported Third Industrial Revolution of the post-World War II, mid to late 20th century, was revealed to be merely the full flowering of the turn of the 20th century electromagnetic revolution that had succeeded the original Industrial Revolution's thermodynamics. Cybernetics turned out to be the latest expression of liberal democracy. If you know Adam Curtis's various documentary series, for instance, All Embraced by Machines of Loving Grace, or All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace. However, steampunk fantasies haunted historical memory in the 1990s. So 19th century Gilded Age capitalism, steampunk, haunted memories of the 1990s cybernetic era. But already in the 1970s, at the beginning of neoliberalism, Star Wars, Alien, and Blade Runner showed us the used future of decrepit Fordist capital. Neoliberalism has naturalized this. The retrospective view from the present allows for regarding the 20th century as the outcome of the Gilded Age, of the Second Industrial Revolution. But the 20th century was conditioned by the mounting discontents of the Gilded Age and its crisis in the early 20th century. Most apocalyptically, its crisis was expressed in the First World War and its aftermath, the revolutions that came at the end of World War I. We still live in the after effects of that crisis, which continued the 20th century. Which conditioned the 20th century. The inability to overcome the discontents of capital from a century ago still swamps us today. In the late 19th century, in the United States of the late 19th century, the Second Industrial Revolution was governed largely by the Republican Party, which was the combined party of progressive liberalism and big capital. The Democratic Party in this period, by contrast, was the party of the middle class and conservatism. So, for instance, populism, as an 1890s Depression era phenomenon, fed into the Democratic Party, with William Jennings Bryan, the Democrats' unsuccessful candidate for president in 1896 and again in 1900. So, Aaron, I'd like to ask you to put up the cover of Harper's Weekly from 1896, if you have that available. Okay, so Harper's, which recently became embroiled in a controversy for an open letter defending free speech, you might recall, in recent weeks. So Harper's was a pro-Republican Party, liberal, progressive liberal journal, then as now. So they were associated with the Republican Party precisely because the Republican Party was the progressive liberal party of the time. And they are attacking the Democratic Party candidate. And you'll see to his right, to our left, you'll see that one of the wind-up doll toys accompanying the Wonder Boy, William Jennings Bryan, is Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs in 1896 was a supporter of William Jennings Bryan. This was before Debs had become a Marxist and a socialist. He was a labor organizer, a labor militant, but not yet a socialist and a Marxist. So Debs is seen here as a kind of a sidekick, but also a kind of pathetic figure alongside William Jennings Bryan. And you'll also see behind William Jennings Bryan, you'll see Tammany Hall represented by some kind of a cat, maybe a tiger, a kind of taxidermy, kind of desiccated tiger playing a drum, Tammany Hall. So they're condemning the Democratic Party, and they're specifically condemning the attempt to change the Democratic Party through the populist movement of William Jennings Bryan, who ran in 1896 and in 1900. Okay, we'll come back to another Harper's image from a little bit later. So William Jennings Bryan was the Democrats' unsuccessful candidate for president in 1896 and again in 1900. We might consider Bernie Sanders, although he calls himself a socialist and he respects the history of Eugene Debs, that actually Sanders running for the Democratic nomination in 2016 and again in 2020 repeats that kind of history. He's more of a William Jennings Bryan figure, Bernie Sanders, than he is a Eugene Debs figure. He's more of a left populist than he is actually a socialist. It's the left populist complement to the supposed right populism of Donald Trump. Progressivism, so this is really the issue that I want to bring into consideration. Progressivism emerged as a reform effort from within the Republican Party against manifest problems of liberal capitalism in the 1890s and 1900s. Most dramatically under President Theodore Roosevelt. So Theodore Roosevelt was elected vice president, but he succeeded to the presidency upon the assassination of President McKinley, assassinated by an anarchist in protest of the role of the United States in the Philippines. So anti-imperialist protester killed the newly elected president of the United States, and Theodore Roosevelt became president. And he tried to institute some reforms, which I'm going to address in a moment. In Europe at this time, discontents with the Gilded Age, or the Second Industrial Revolution, manifested in the socialist parties of the Second International, the Socialist International. Liberal capitalism was opposed by a mass industrial workers' politics, most significantly in the major party of the Second International, the SPD, the Social Democratic Party of Germany. In the United Kingdom, discontents with liberalism led to the formation of the Labour Party. These parties had origins originally in the 1870s, but experienced phenomenal growth, especially in the aftermath of the crisis of the 1890s. So in the 1870s, there was an economic panic in 1873 that actually led to the defeat of Reconstruction in the United States. It led to a Democratic Party congressional sweep in the midterm elections of 1874 and hamstrung President Grant in the last years of his second term up to 1876. He tried to keep Reconstruction going, but was really undermined by the Democrats gaining a majority in Congress. But there was another later crisis, the crisis of the 1890s. There was actually an 1893 panic that led to the depression of the 1890s. And really, it's out of the devastation of the 1890s crisis that you get a really rapid, in the recovery from that, a really rapid industrialization era throughout the world. And it's that era of the 1890s that's really the massification of these socialist parties. So they originate in the 1870s, but really take on a massive character in the 1890s. Countries also drawn into the Second Industrial Revolution, besides the United States, Germany, and Japan, more broadly, but on a subordinate and subsidiary basis, included the Russian Empire, which ended up being a kind of manufacturing center of the world, where the largest factories in the world were located, and Italy, which also experienced mass radicalization in the form of new social democratic and socialist parties. So of course, Lenin and the Bolsheviks are a wing of Russian social democracy, which grows tremendously in the 1890s and gets serious about its party organizing in the 1900s. And in Italy, the Socialist Party develops in this period as well. However, these new socialist parties also experienced a crisis of their growth in the 1890s, a crisis of their political purpose. Were they, as they claimed, parties of political revolution, or rather, parties of social reform? Eduard Bernstein was the most perspicacious of the commentators on the developments of this period in the 1890s. He regarded the growth of the United Kingdom, the British workers' movement, that led to the formation of the Labour Party as evidence that a revolutionary socialist political party may not be necessary for the transformation of capitalism into socialism. Socialism may socially evolve within capitalism rather than requiring its political overthrow. The eventual election of majority socialist or Labour parties may be sufficient to crown the development of the social movement of the working class through its civil society organizations, such as labor unions and other social collectives, women's organizations, etc. The 20th century, however, belied this socialist optimism of the late 19th century that Marxism had in common with liberalism. Just as progressivism expressed manifest problems of liberal capitalism, so the new distinctly revolutionary current in socialism, beginning circa 1900, represented by Rosa Luxemburg, Lenin, Trotsky, and others, as well as by Eugene Debs in the United States, who was converted to Marxism in the late 1890s, expressed discontent with socialist reformism. So reformism became a problem as a function of the growth of these socialist parties. Luxemburg, for instance, called Bernstein simply a liberal. What this meant was that Bernstein regarded liberal democracy as politically adequate for the activity of the working class in its struggle for socialism. Bernstein thought that the capitalist interest could be subordinated to a political majority. What Bernstein didn't reckon with was how the working class would become politically split in the crisis of capitalism. In the First World War and the revolutions in Russia, Germany, Italy, and Hungary that broke out in its aftermath from 1917 to 1919, the former socialist parties of the Second International divided between reformist social democrats and revolutionary communists. In 1919, responding to criticisms of the course of the Russian Revolution, Debs declared that, quote, "From the crown of my head to the soles of my feet, I am a Bolshevik and proud of it." So Debs was on the revolutionary side of that split. This is related to how progressivism emerged contemporaneously from the crisis of liberalism. It was acrimonious as well. So incumbent President Taft condemned his challenger, his former friend and colleague Theodore Roosevelt, the Progressive Party candidate for president in 1912, as the most dangerous man in America. Debs called Theodore Roosevelt, a psychopath. But this Progressive Party challenge that came from Theodore Roosevelt led via the actual beneficiary of the split among the Republicans, Woodrow Wilson's more socially conservative, for example, avowedly racist, Democratic Party progressivism, to electoral victory in 1912, and then that led ultimately to Theodore Roosevelt's nephew-in-law, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal 20 years later. And there's an important historical figure, Harold Ickes, who helped craft Theodore Roosevelt's program in 1912, and who also crafted the New Deal in 1932. The question, therefore, is the alternative to capitalist progressivism offered by Marxist socialism. In the US, Eugene Debs' Socialist Party of America sought to intervene with working-class socialism across the division of Republican Party big capitalist liberalism versus Democratic Party middle-class conservatism. Industrial democracy was the term of the socialist opposition under Marxist leadership. As a Marxist, Debs, like Rosa Luxemburg, understood that this pressed a contradiction. Marxism was not an authoritarian collectivist opposition to liberalism, but rather sought to combine and transcend middle-class conservative reactionary discontents over the destructive effects of capitalism with the revolutionary social potential of the dynamics of big capital. Debs articulated this in his 1900 election manifesto, first delivered as a speech in Chicago on competition versus cooperation, one of the readings I provided as recommended background for today. This is Debs. He says, "The Republican platform is a self-congratulation of the dominant capitalist class. Prosperity galore, give us 4 years more. The Democratic platform is the wail and cry of the perishing middle class. Calamity without end. The Social Democratic platform, by contrast, is an indictment of the capitalist system. It is the call to class consciousness and political action of the exploited working class. And it is a ringing declaration in favor of collective ownership of all the means of production and distribution as the clarion voice of economic freedom." Progressivism sought to similarly transcend the liberal capitalist versus conservative populist divide emerging from industrialization, which is why liberals could observe in 1912 that Theodore Roosevelt's Progressive Party was seeking to usurp the mantles of both William Jennings Bryan's populist Democrats and Debs's socialists. So Aaron, if you could put up that Harper's cartoon from 1912. Right, so in the upper right-hand corner, we have Theodore Roosevelt. So I guess what we have here is William Jennings Bryan on the left and Eugene Debs in the middle, going for a swim in a lake and leaving their clothes on the shore. And in the upper right-hand corner, we have Theodore Roosevelt stealing the clothes of Debs, the clothes of socialism. And the caption is, William Jennings Bryan says, "Say, Debs, he's took everything that belonged to me, and now he's gone off with yours too." So this is, again, another Harper's cartoon. So this is from a Republican sympathetic liberal journal, again, lampooning William Jennings Bryan and Eugene Debs, and not exactly endorsing Roosevelt, by the way, right? So that's the other thing, because the Republicans were split between Taft and Roosevelt in 1912, and that's what allowed Woodrow Wilson to be elected. So Democrat Woodrow Wilson's election as president in 1912 was the result of the split among the Republicans between progressives and old-style liberals. This set the stage for the triumph of New Deal progressivism under FDR, however, 20 years later, after the crisis of the Great Depression. So what Theodore Roosevelt had crafted as a reform of capitalism based on big capital in 1912, in an era of prosperity, but still social problems, only had an opportunity to be implemented 20 years later because of the Great Depression. So it was implemented under the exact opposite conditions in which it had been originally conceived. It was originally conceived as an attempt to maintain capitalist progress. When FDR implemented it, it was to save capitalism from itself, which is very different. Also, for Theodore Roosevelt, it was crafted, progressive capitalist reform was crafted specifically to head off the threat of socialism. So Theodore Roosevelt, among other progressives, studied the rise of socialism, not only in the United States, but also in Europe, where it was more politically significant and stronger. And he regarded the rise of a proletarian socialist movement, a working class socialist movement, and therefore of Marxism, as a symptom of the problems of capitalism in his time, which of course he was opposed to socialism, he was opposed to Marxism. However, he still saw it as a significant symptom and as a significant threat. In 1933, however, when FDR came into office, the capitalist reforms, taken up 20 years later, again, the same reforms that Theodore Roosevelt proposed in 1912, were implemented not to head off the threat of socialism, but rather to save capitalism, which is very different. FDR's New Dealism, specifically as a Democratic Party phenomenon, rather than as a progressive, liberal, Republican Party phenomenon, as it was under Theodore Roosevelt, combined, though FDR combined, but did not transcend the split of progressive capitalism with middle-class conservatism. So the Democratic Party, up until FDR, was the middle-class conservative party, as opposed to the big capitalist progressive party. And with FDR, he sought to combine these two, combine middle-class conservatism and big capitalist progressivism. The working class, however, was thus bound in the Democratic Party to both big capital and the middle class. The working class struggle for socialism, found earlier in the old Socialist Party of America, was squeezed out between these two aspects of the progressive New Deal Democrats. Socialism in the United States never recovered from this suppression that took place. The New Deal coalition Democrats became the ruling party in the United States in the high 20th century, and are still the majority party in the United States. If you look at population-wise, the Democrats represent the majority of the American population politically. They still are the dominant party, ever since FDR. The Democrats have tried, ever since FDR, to retain a progressive capitalist alliance of liberal capital with middle-class conservatism. But what happened in the political crisis of the New Deal coalition in the 1960s, signaled by the civil rights movement, as well as the US's losing war in Vietnam, combined with the crisis of capitalism in the 1970s, the downturn that took place in the 1970s that led to neoliberalism, was that the form of middle-class conservatism changed and was captured by the Republican Party instead. This was not only expressed in the Southern strategy that captured the Dixiecrat middle class of racial conservatives, but also the appeal to law and order that captured the Northern urban and suburban working class, ethnics, who had previously supported the New Deal Democrats. So one side note with respect to the last lectures on the Civil War and failed Reconstruction, this is often forgotten. The Republican Party at the time of Theodore Roosevelt, also at the time of FDR, the Republican Party was the Black Party in the United States. It was the Progressive Liberal Party, and it was the party of Black America. Really, only in the 1960s does the Democratic Party become the representative party of Black Americans. So that's often forgotten, but is nonetheless true. And that's an index of a shift in American politics from the Gilded Age era into the 20th century. So a shift in the way the parties divided up the electorate and also what they represented. The Republicans were originally the Progressive Liberal Party, and the Democrats were the Conservative Party. But after FDR, it switched, and the Democrats became the Progressive Liberal Party, and the Republicans became the Conservative Party. Subsequently, this has taken the otherwise long-standing form of the old split within liberalism that progressivism represented. Progressive liberalism versus conservative liberalism. The conservative liberals have promised the middle class that it will benefit from big capital, whereas the progressive liberals have actively sought policies that will ensure this. But neither the promise nor the policies have been able to prevent the social destruction and hence the conservative reaction of the middle class. Both the Republicans and Democrats have exploited middle-class discontents without satisfying them. The working class has been the passive object of this process, oscillating between big capitalist liberalism and middle-class conservatism. However, in the obscure form of oscillating between greater or lesser support for progressive liberalism, greater or lesser support for the Democrats. Politically, this means the subordination of the working class to the middle class. But which middle class? The 20th century saw the rise of the new middle class of corporate capitalist managers, as opposed to the old middle class of small proprietors as well as of artisanal workers. The old middle class were the petite bourgeoisie, which were always distinct from the new industrial working class ever since the 19th century. So the question in the 20th century became the relation of the proletarianized working class of wage earners and the capitalist managerial middle class. Could the middle class be captured by progressive liberalism? Or would the perennial crisis of capitalism lead instead to populist conservatism? How could populism, whether middle or working class, be neutralized as a disruptive threat to the negotiations of big capitalist politics? From the era of the late 19th century Second International, Debs, Eugene Debs, serves as an example of how a populist could become a socialist and not a progressive liberal. By contrast, Edward Bernstein, revisionist reformism, shows how a Marxist could become a progressive liberal via the liquidation of proletarian socialism by the neglect of the appeal of middle-class conservatism to which the working class could succumb in its trade unionism. The working class is susceptible to middle-class conservatism insofar as it remains attached to a prior form of capitalism, the accumulated ensemble of previous concrete forms of wage labor that undergoes crisis and is destroyed. Progressivism depends conversely upon the amenability and liberalism of the middle class to go along with changes in capitalism that are led by big capital. Big capital benefits from all changes anyway. Capitalists can shift their investments or retire into philanthropy, and entire countries can adopt what Lenin called coupon clipping. So the real issue is the struggle to come out on top, or simply not to sink entirely, but keep one's head above water in the next wave of capitalism. Conservatives are always there to try to take advantage of those swamped and potentially left behind, with demagogic appeals to the status quo that people forget was itself once something new. The question is, who are the progressives and who are the conservatives politically? Perhaps the progressives are the more cunning conservatives, or the conservatives are the more cunning progressives. In the last generation of neoliberalism, the Republicans could plausibly claim to be the true revolutionaries advancing capitalism, and thus addressed and exploited the manifest liabilities of the Democrats' conservatism. The game is to capture middle-class discontents in progressive capitalist reforms, such as welfare reform, trade reform, etc. The Republicans did so through the Reagan Revolution, just as the Democrats had done in the 1930s FDR New Deal coalition, through which they had replaced the Republicans as the dominant majority party since the Civil War. Every old conservative was once a new revolutionary in capitalism. Proletarian socialism, Marxism, by contrast, sought to subordinate the middle class to the working class in reappropriating capital, which it proposed could only happen through the dictatorship of the proletariat. The political party for proletarian socialism thus sought to lead the broader masses in social democracy to achieve socialism. This would be especially true of the new managerial middle class, which could simply take direction from the working class where they formerly did so from the capitalists, including from the capitalist state and its state capitalist managerial policies. Thus, the capitalists could be retired into philanthropy. This was the vision of the Second International from 1889 to 1914, and of mid-20th century social democratic politics. Especially since it was understood by Marxism, for instance, by Lenin's conception of contemporary imperialism or monopoly capitalism, that not only the new middle class as corporate employees, but also the working class itself subsisted not on the value of their own laboring activity, but rather on a cut of the profits of capital, which was granted to them for political reasons through a myriad of government subsidies to prevent revolution, not merely to soften the blows of the business cycle of boom and bust. Theodore Roosevelt called this the need for a square deal. Indicatively, not a fair deal, not merely enforcing liberal capitalism, but the government actively ameliorating its defects, and understood it explicitly as required to stave off socialism. But Roosevelt had not Marx's vague specter of communism, but Debs's actual mass Socialist Party of America staring him down to draw this political conclusion. It was a rearguard action, but with a visionary long view. Progressivism was meant to institute political reforms required to be up to date with capitalist development. It was a matter not so much of advancing history as catching up with it. In this sense, it still accorded with classical liberalism that the state should follow society and not try to determine it. But since Roosevelt's time, new problems arising from reforms attempted in the 20th century have clouded the issue. However, the essential political predicament of liberal democracy in the industrial era remains. The problem and task of progressive capitalism is the attempt to maintain capitalism through its manifest social and political crisis. The alignment of the working class with the middle class in common capitalist interest with big capital is always temporary and inevitably fraught. There is always a struggle for supremacy in the fractious, politically negotiated social alliance of capital, which will inevitably burst forth from the inexorable obsolescence of any and all concrete forms of capitalism in society. The question the capitalist periodically faces: can the conservative reactionary middle class be made to go in peace? For example, overdose on opioids, and before that, on whiskey. It is important to note that the progressives advocated prohibition back in the day. Or will that conservative reactionary middle class freak out and disrupt society and politics in uncontrollable ways? Trotsky called fascism the petite bourgeoisie run amok. But every old middle class was once a new middle class, just as every old form of wage labor was once a new form of capitalism. The working class's discontents are subsumed under middle class conservatism. The potential for socialism and capitalism thus disappears. The contradiction of capital that Marxism once recognized is submerged. The progressive capitalist political forms that emerged as an alternative to Marxist socialism after the crisis of the Gilded Age and were carried through the 20th century have exhausted themselves in two waves of crisis. The crisis of the 1960s and 70s that led to neoliberalism, and the present crisis of neoliberalism itself in the 2000s and 10s. The attempted return to the Gilded Age since the 1980s and 90s has clearly failed, which is why this deeper history leading to the present reasserts itself today. It is undigested. Glenn Beck, the conservative commentator, was not wrong to panic at the sight of Trump and take his ascendancy as the occasion to condemn the progressivism of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson from a century ago. Beck counterposed the America of the Founding Fathers, Washington and Jefferson, to that of the progressivism of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, calling the 2016 election the final defeat of the former by the latter, the final defeat of the American Revolution by progressivism. Neglected by Beck in his division of American history, however, is Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War as a second founding moment of the United States. But the evident desire for return to the apparently more innocent time of the Second Industrial Revolution and its liberal optimism neglects its real discontents and actual crisis in the Gilded Age, which once were expressed by Marxist socialism in the era of the Marxist-led parties of the Second International, including the Socialist Party of America of Eugene Debs, but were captured instead by progressive state capitalism in the 20th century that Beck and other conservative liberals constantly bemoan, regretting its political necessity. Today, the question is the future of that 20th century state capitalism, no matter how rickety, that still dominates the world. Its prospects look grim, China notwithstanding. But actually, it is no more grim than the 20th century itself, or the late 19th century Gilded Age, Second Industrial Revolution capitalism that gave birth to the 20th century. Now, as before, the Republicans and Democrats compete over the political capture of middle-class conservative reaction by big capital in service of a capitalist progress that is none. What disappears is the possibility once recognized by Marxism of the working class through proletarian socialism superseding both progressive capital and middle-class reaction. Without it, capitalism is permanent, the middle class under threat periodically runs amok, old tenements are torn down, slums are cleared, and new dormitories for the working class are hastily constructed. And in the end, the best we can hope for is another industrial revolution, with all the destruction that it will inevitably bring. Okay, I know that I've gone a little bit long, and so I will leave my lecture off on that and perhaps bring up some other points during our discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. So Chris, just one point, when we're answering the questions, sometimes the questions might move in your Q&A box from open to answered. So if you look, let's find it, go to the answered tab. But we're going to start with a question from Richard Rubin. With respect to the continued importance of the American Revolution that you mentioned in your introductory comments, to what extent is this dependent on the hegemonic role of American capitalism? Is it possible to imagine a future decline in American power in a still capitalist world? And if so, would that diminish the continuing significance of the American Revolution? Or does the significance of the American Revolution transcend the global role of American capitalism?
Okay, so what immediately comes to mind are a couple of things. So one is the Tiananmen Square protests in China around the same time as the collapse of the Soviet Union back in 1989, but also the recent protests in Hong Kong against the imposition of laws dictated by the Communist Party of China on Hong Kong. In both cases, the American Revolution was evoked. So there was Lady Liberty in Tiananmen Square, a makeshift sculpture that was erected, and also in the Hong Kong, the ideology of the Hong Kong protests. The desire for independence from Chinese diktat meant an invocation of the American Declaration of Independence of 1776. So the only, we might say, there are two possible inheritors of US global hegemony, and at present, in terms of what's apparent, and that's the EU and China. Meaning, if the US were to permanently decline, then perhaps its hegemonic role in global capitalism could be replaced by either the EU or China. So the question is, what would be the history informing that new political hegemony? What would its relationship be to the bourgeois revolutionary era and the American Revolution in particular? I think it would still be there, however it would be obscured. I also think that while this is possible, at some point, that we should not expect it in the immediate future. In other words, both the EU and China face considerable difficulties in replacing the preeminent place of the United States, either in the political or in the economic order of global capitalism. So the US it's not a matter of retaining its political prominence, but losing its economic prominence. It remains economically prominent. And perhaps will continue to do so. So I don't think that we can assume the decline of either US economic or political preeminence in global capitalism. We can't assume that in the immediate future. And if it were to happen, then there's the question of how the preceding history of capitalism will inform the ideology, really, political ideology, the self-understanding of politics in global capitalism. I think that the bourgeois revolution will continue to come up for reconsideration. I think it's inevitably recalled by the social relations of capitalism, by the bourgeois social relations of capitalism. Discontents in capitalism will inevitably reach back to the self-understanding of the bourgeois revolution. And the American Revolution has a central place in that self-understanding, and therefore will always be a place of return. So it's not dependent on what might appear to be a coincidence. Is it a coincidence that the United States became the preeminent capitalist country in the world, both economically and politically? Is that an accident of history? Perhaps. I mean, you could say the Second Industrial Revolution, perhaps the Civil War, that these are contingent phenomena that led to the US inheriting global capitalism from the British, who were the previous economic and political hegemonic capitalist country. You could say it could have gone another way. So for instance, there has been, ever since the New Left, but not before then, by the way, but ever since the New Left, there's been this idea that it might have been better for the world if the North had lost the Civil War, if the South had won the Civil War, because it would have prevented the rise of US imperialism. I think that's fanciful. I think that any military victory by the South over the North in the Civil War would have been short-lived as a political phenomenon. I don't think that, because as we know, it wouldn't have actually divided the country. What would have happened would have been a reunification on the South's terms, and that would have created problems in the North that probably Southern political domination would not have been able to handle. And again, we should not forget that the Republican Party, the North, dominated American politics after the Civil War, and not just as a virtue of the military victory.
Okay, our next question comes from Kevin Dong. Kevin asks, the rise of the SPD, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, was facilitated by the backwater, quote, Wild West of Germany, and the Russian Revolution turned the liability of the backwardness of Russia into an advantage for making the revolution. The Gilded Age and Debs' Socialist Party in America did not have any of that, so weren't prospects for the revolution in the United States defeated off the bat?
Okay, so that's actually a point that I wanted to emphasize, which is actually the United States was relatively backward in this era, in the pre-World War I era. So Kevin raised this question, the Wild West character of Germany. So actually, of course, the Wild West is in the United States. And the Wild West in the United States is really a post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction phenomenon. And really lasts into the early 20th century, that character of a kind of unbridled, kind of anarchical, rapid industrialization of the United States. The Wild West kind of exemplifies that to some degree. And what people forget is that Germany, in its rapid industrialization in the same contemporaneous period in the late 19th and early 20th century, we have this image of Germany as being a kind of, well buttoned up, repressed kind of Middle European country that is actually belied by what it looked like in its period of actual industrialization after the Franco-Prussian War in the 1880s and 90s. It also had kind of anarchic and backward character. So it's not the case that, I don't think, that either American socialism a la Eugene Debs was more or less likely to be able to lead a socialist revolution successfully in the United States by comparison with the SPD in Germany or by comparison with Russian social democracy. I think what's actually of interest is considering the history of socialism in two waves. Namely, early socialism is really a French and British phenomenon from the first industrial revolution. So you see Chartism, but also utopian socialism, and in England, but also you see utopian socialism of other varieties and Proudhonian anarchist socialism in France as a function of the first industrial revolution, the early 19th century, whereas Marxism attains ideological hegemony as a function of the second industrial revolution, and less so in countries like Britain and France, and more so in Germany, the United States, Russia, Italy. It's also represented in Japan, by the way. It's also represented in Japan, however, not as successfully. So that's what we would have to consider. We'd have to consider the different waves of socialism and where they were successful in which countries, in which particular historical eras. And in that respect, there is a theory, an anti-Marxist theory, that we would nonetheless have to entertain, which is that perhaps socialism is itself a phenomenon of backwardness. In other words, maybe socialism is an ideology that grips the working class in the throes of industrialization, but wanes subsequently. So you have a waning of the prominence of socialism in England and France as it rises in places like Germany, the United States, and Russia. And of course, it also wanes in the United States and in Germany. So even though the SPD is a major capitalist party in Germany today, it hardly in any way represents the socialism of the Second Industrial Revolution, the socialism of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And certainly the French Socialist Party and then later the French Communist Party in the 20th century also did not represent, either in the 1930s or after World War II, did not represent the kind of militant labor radicalism of the earlier 20th century and late 19th century.
You know, Chris, since there, oh wait, we did get another question, so maybe take that. Okay, oh great, wonderful, we have some questions coming in. Okay, the next question comes from, well, first actually, because two came in at the same time, so I'm going to do one that's a follow-up to the last question.
Okay.
And it comes from Spencer Leonard, excuse me. How does the backward character of the United States as a late-coming Second Industrial Revolution country condition American political history, and specifically the history of the Republican Party, from the end of the Civil War to the Spanish-American War, and on to the administration of Teddy Roosevelt? How has this been understood more or less adequately on the left?
Right. So the article that I wrote back in 2017, that was the basis of my lecture today, was really based on this problem, the problem of how to understand progressive capitalist politics. And we can also call that progressive liberalism. And progressive liberalism is itself a phenomenon of this late 19th and early 20th century Second Industrial Revolution era capitalism. And by the way, I don't want to overstate the case. Of course, the old industrial countries like England and France and Belgium and the Netherlands were also affected. They're also part of the Second Industrial Revolution as well in the same era. So one of the parallels that I drew was between the crisis of the United Kingdom Liberal Party that led to the rise of the Labour Party. So essentially what happened was that the Liberal Party was replaced by the Labour Party in the early 20th century as a function of the crisis of liberalism. And that this suggests the same kind of phenomenon, namely the crisis of liberalism in the United States, and liberalism represented by the Republican Party. So again, we tend to think of liberalism in terms of FDR progressive liberalism, but there is an earlier version of that, and that's the progressive liberalism of the Republican Party, again, as represented by Theodore Roosevelt, but also you could say certainly the Republican Party from its inception in the 1850s and through the prosecution of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, that this is progressive liberalism. Right? This is liberal democratic politics that is seeking progress. Right? It's offering for progress as against the conservatives represented by the Democratic Party. And this continues through Reconstruction with Ulysses S. Grant, and it also continues through subsequent Republican administrations. So it's not something wholly new with Theodore Roosevelt. Rather, Theodore Roosevelt is a progressive liberalism conditioned by the results of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. So whereas Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant are not yet confronted with the specific tasks of an industrialized United States, that really happens after failed Reconstruction. It happens really quite late in the 1890s. Theodore Roosevelt is responding as a progressive liberal to changed realities, of industrial capitalism on a mass scale. Of course, there was always, the United States was always affected by the old Industrial Revolution coming out of Western Europe. And there was always industry in the United States in the 19th century. But industrialization really grips the United States in the late 19th century. And that's where the populist movement comes in. So the populist movement of William Jennings Bryan is a response to the destruction of the middle class by industrialization. That's where the populist movement comes from. But that populism is an attempt to stave off the effects of industrialization, to turn back the clock on capitalism. So Debs calls it the wail of the dying middle class, calamity without end. Whereas the Republicans, the ruling party, and the Progressive Liberal Party politically bank on the continued success of capitalism. Prosperity galore, give us 4 years more. So it's important, I think that in hindsight with FDR, we start to look at people like William Jennings Bryan as if they're progressives. But then the question is, what is progressivism? What is progressivism? And also, why is it expressed? Why is populism tied into the Democratic Party rather than the Republican Party? And I should also say, of course, based on the earlier lectures, that the Republican Party is not only the progressive capitalist party, it's also the working class party, and it's the Black Party. So by contrast, the Democratic Party is the planter party, the Southern Bourbon Party. It's also the middle class party, and it's the party of immigrant, ethnic working class people who are not yet fully integrated. So it's not, again, the working class character of the Republican Party is not total by any means, but it's predominant looked at the United States as a whole. And certainly that's part of the free labor ideology of the Republican Party. So what we're talking about here is how socialism emerged at a global scale, but also in the United States as a function of changes in society that come with industrial capitalism, which pose the question of liberal democracy. It really poses the issue of liberal democracy. What's the basis of liberal democracy? Because, of course, the capitalist class is too narrow a basis for liberal democratic politics. It always needs support from the middle class, and the middle class as this ill-defined term. In other words, who's the middle class? They're the small proprietors, are the high-income working class people? What is middle class? And I did engage in some of that rhetoric deliberately in my presentation, because it is characteristic of American politics to call workers middle class, right? So middle class just means you're not poor and you're not rich. So if you're a worker and you're making a decent living, you're middle class. It's a very ill-defined category. And I took that up. Right? So of course, capitalist politics denies that the working class per se has a separate and antagonistic and opposed interest, as opposed to either the middle class, whether small proprietor or managerial middle class, professional middle class, or the big capitalist class, right? Capitalist politics always preaches some form of democratic unity, small d democratic unity. And it's socialists, Marxists, who point out the conflict and the manifestation of social contradiction there between the working class and the middle class, and certainly between the working class and the capitalist class. And so that's what we're really talking about, I think, with respect to the phenomenon of the crisis of liberalism. The crisis of liberalism is a crisis in the ability to have an electoral majority a consensus, a capitalist consensus that unites the capitalists and the middle class and even the working class. So socialists tried to take advantage of the crisis of such capitalist politics, of such liberal democratic politics, and establish an independent politics of the working class. And of course, an independent working class politics not geared towards a capitalist reform party like the Labor Party, but rather for a revolutionary socialist party. And that's what I tried to get into in my presentation. What is the actual vision here? So I'll finally say that Debs, for instance, in one of the articles I recommended as background reading, Cooperation and Competition, attacks the phenomenon of imperialism. So William Jennings Bryan is an anti-imperialist, but what is he against in terms of imperialism? He's against big capital. He's against big capital, monopoly capital, finance capital, and the kind of capitalist interest in foreign policy, in overseas expansion, and in competition by the United States on the global market in the capitalist world. So he's opposing imperialism, William Jennings Bryan, as a populist. He's opposing it from the right, from the standpoint of the middle class that is threatened by imperialism. So it's a conservative reactionary opposition to imperialism. That is not the socialist opposition to imperialism. The socialist opposition to imperialism is not that it wants to tear down imperial capitalism, that it wants to tear down finance capital or big capital and its role in global capitalism, but rather it wants to appropriate it. It wants to take it over. So, for instance, Woodrow Wilson's version of progressivism is not like Theodore Roosevelt. So Theodore Roosevelt wants to regulate big capitalism. Woodrow Wilson wants to break it up. Right? Not regulate the trusts, but break up the trusts, trust busting. Debs points out that, of course, the working class in struggling for socialism doesn't want to break up the trusts, but wants to take them over in the dictatorship of the proletariat. So even the progressivism of Woodrow Wilson is not so progressive because it actually does seek to turn back the clock on capitalist development and therefore restore a kind of greater balance in liberal democratic civil society, to tear down the exorbitant power of big capital. Whereas socialists pursue socialism, from at least Marxist socialists, of course not anti-Marxist socialists, but Marxist socialists, seek to pursue socialism along the line of big capital. On the imperialism question, because of course one of the things that I don't raise in my article or in the presentation I just gave, but I will comment upon now, is Theodore Roosevelt as an imperialist in the conventional sense of aggressive foreign policy, of course the Spanish-American War, and finally the suppression of the insurgency in the Philippines that took place in his era. Right, so what is that about? And so I'm always reminded, well, a couple of things. One is the kind of social Darwinist vision that Theodore Roosevelt had as a progressive liberal. So he was a social Darwinist. As a progressive liberal, he's a social Darwinist. So what does that mean? Because he can be, regarded as a racist, as an imperialist, this and that, but what is the actual substance of it? So Roosevelt considered the dominant capitalist countries of the world of his time to have solved a basic civilizational problem and therefore achieved a superior form of civilization. So he considered the British, the Americans, and also the Japanese. And he saw the Germans as perhaps achieving this, and maybe the French also, although he really considered it to be a British, French, and Japanese phenomenon, that they had organized their society in such a way so that the ruling class, the ruling elites, were actually the best people. It's this kind of social Darwinism. So the kind of racism that a Theodore Roosevelt has is not a racism of all white people are superior to all non-white people, or, you know, in the United States context, all white people are superior to all black people, or something like that. Rather, the idea is that white civilization, or Anglo-American civilization, European civilization, Western civilization, but especially British and American civilization, and in Asia, Japanese civilization, had solved the civilizational problem of guaranteeing a real meritocracy, right? This kind of liberal idea of a meritocracy, that they had done away with all arbitrary forms of social hierarchy and achieved a true natural aristocracy and meritocracy. Whereas other civilizations had not achieved that yet. And interestingly enough, one of the controversies of Theodore Roosevelt's administration, I mentioned that the Republicans were the Black Party in this period, was that he had an official dinner for Booker T. Washington at the White House. And the Democrats raised a hue and cry about this and said that Roosevelt had demeaned the White House by inviting Booker T. Washington to dinner there. So Booker T. Washington is a Republican, of course. And what does he represent? What's his ideology for Black America? It's the uplift, up from slavery, led by the talented 10th, right? So the idea is that Black Republicans as a constituency in, or Black Americans as a constituency in the Republican Party represented, right, a social layer, a Black middle class, a talented 10th that would lead Black Americans into integration into American civilization, right? That's the idea. And so the idea is that you cultivate, right, the natural aristocracy, the meritocracy of peoples who have not yet figured out how to order their social life so as to express the true natural elite that should be leading society. It's a liberal idea. It's a liberal idea, and it's a progressive liberal idea from the time. As regards foreign policy, the Spanish-American War, of course, is commonly seen as the emergence of U.S. imperialism in a geopolitical and colonial sense. It's when the United States acquires colonies for the first time. It acquires Puerto Rico, and it acquires the Philippines as overseas colonies, and also some other locations, I believe in the Western Pacific, from Spain. And of course, it dominates Cuba. But the United States already dominated Cuba before the Spanish-American War. And what happened in the Spanish-American War was that the United States regarded Spanish rule in Cuba as a liability. In other words, as a threat to American interests in Cuba. But the US already economically dominated Cuba before the Spanish-American War took place. The Philippines is a little bit of a different story. And of course, in Cuba and in the Philippines, there was a sense of betrayal that the United States had sided with the insurgents against the Spanish in the Spanish-American War, but then had not allowed the insurgents to come to political power in either country, in either Cuba or in the Philippines. So there was a sense of betrayal. And of course, the suppression of the insurrection against American rule in the Philippines was long and bloody, and quite atrocious. But I'm always reminded of a liberal nationalist, Filipino nationalist, Emilio Aguinaldo, who observed in the era of US domination of the Philippines, specifically in the 1920s and 30s, so after World War I, he observed, so he was a fighter for Filipino independence from the United States. He wanted decolonization. He wanted Philippine independence from the United States. And, off and on was an insurgent against American rule in the Philippines. But he very realistically observed, he said, the question for the Philippines is not Filipino independence. It's rather, whether we will be dominated by the Japanese or by the Americans. That's real. So we should recognize the lesson of decolonization in the 20th century. I mentioned it in my just briefly in my presentation, namely the problem of neocolonialism, meaning formal colonization, formal colonialism can end without the colonial relationship of dependency on global capitalism going away. Which then raises the question of, decolonization. What's meant by decolonization? What's meant by colonialism? What is its relationship to capitalism? And of course, the term imperialism is loaded because empire is a dirty word, especially in American politics. In American politics, imperialism is a derogatory term. No one wants to be an imperialist. All politics in the United States is liberal, whether progressive or conservative, it's still liberal. And empire and imperialism is not to the sensibility, does not accord with the sensibility of a liberal democratic spirit as dominates ideologically the politics of the United States. Nobody wants to be an empire in the United States. It was actually remarkable during the War on Terror, the George W. Bush administration, when the Department of Homeland Security was established. When the Department of Homeland Security was established, that was the first official recognition of empire, meaning you only have a homeland if you have an empire. So Department of Homeland Security indicated the acknowledgement of an American empire, but ironically enough, it's precisely when such an American empire was experiencing difficulties and really going into decline. Namely, the US as the global policeman. The War on Terror showed the limits of that, So its first acknowledgement was actually post-dated after the fact. So with respect to imperialism, I prefer the use of a strict Marxist definition of imperialism, namely late capitalism, the highest possible stage of capitalism, the stage of capitalism that leads to socialist revolution. And as such, it refers to not the empire, not a colonial empire, but rather to the imperial state, to the role of an imperial state in managing capitalism. Because really, colonial empire is a projection of that domestic imperial state, rather than, we might imagine, the domestic imperial state being a creature of colonial empire. It's rather the opposite. The colonial empire, the political rule of overseas territories, is a projection of that imperial state that grew domestically for reasons of capitalism. So that's the way that I would sort of tie those issues together.
Thanks, Chris. We have a question that is kind of related, but a bit different, but maybe you can speak on it real quick. It's from Aditya Malik. With the emergence of global economy and decentralization of industry production, is capitalism necessarily rooted to primary nation states? For example, American capitalism or a potential EU-China capitalism? If so, what does this mean for the viability of socialism and Marxist organizations? Today's major economic actors seem more than content to freely distribute over whatever convenient nation which offers favorable treatment.
Right. So I think that, it's hard for us to free ourselves from 20th century presuppositions. But it's really the 20th century that nationalized capitalism. So we might, and there might even be some textual rhetorical evidence for this in Marx's own writings and in the writings of Marxism of, for instance, the Second International Era. But I would say, nonetheless, capitalism has always been a global phenomenon from the beginning. Namely, you could say bourgeois social relations, production for trade and commerce always had a global scope to it from the Renaissance onward. The emergence of bourgeois society always had a cosmopolitan character and a global implication and unfolding. However, specifically the industrial era, capitalism in the Marxist sense, is also always, and not merely an international, but a global and cosmopolitan phenomenon. Meaning capitalism develops, the Industrial Revolution develops in the United Kingdom after the United Kingdom had already established a global hegemony of trade and commerce in the mid-18th century. In the 20th century, right, so as a function of the collapse of empires, first in World War I and then in World War II, but really in World War I. So Woodrow Wilson, his vision of a reformed global capitalism, a world safe for democracy after World War I, was to break up the big colonial empires and establish a global system of nation states. And that's the League of Nations. So the Wilsonian world order, as opposed to the old order of colonial empires. And not only colonial empires, but imperial states. So Austria-Hungary, the Russian Empire, although I suppose you could say that Austria-Hungary, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, I guess you could say that they are colonial empires. Are they really colonial empires the way the French and the British empires are? However, I don't really think so. The Prussian Empire as a non-German state, as a state that includes many non-Germans and does not include all Germans, right? So the idea of a global system of nation states, of national states, is really a very late development. So I think it's a mistake to say that capitalism originates in nations and then spreads globally. I think that capitalism always existed globally and then impacted states. And nation states, as we understand them, are really a phenomenon of the 20th century. They're a phenomenon of post-World War I and especially post-World War II. So it's the Wilsonian vision that's only brought to fruition in the United Nations after World War II. After a kind of an attempt to reorder and reestablish colonial empires by the Axis powers, by the Japanese, the Germans, and the Italians. So the Italians tried to create a colonial empire for themselves in the Mediterranean. The Japanese, of course, had the East Asian co-prosperity sphere and tried to establish a colonial empire for themselves in Asia. And Germany really aimed to dominate Europe, but also aimed to dominate Eurasia, Russia, and had an explicit vision for populating Russia with Germans and subordinating the Slavic peoples and perhaps just working them to death as a slave population. So, of course, that vision didn't work. And so what did prevail in the 20th century? Under more or less American leadership, after World War I, with the League of Nations, with Woodrow Wilson's vision, but also, and really finally after World War II, with a full decolonization of the old colonial empires. That's the rise of national capitalism. And of course, it's not national capitalism. It's a nation state political order for global capitalism, meaning it's a way of politically managing a global capitalist system from the beginning. And like I said, it's a rather late development. So in that respect, I don't think anything has particularly changed in the last 50 years or in the last 30 years. So neither starting in the era of neoliberalism in the 70s and 80s, nor in the 90s with the end of the Cold War. And I think that is really the subtext of this misconception of national capitalism is socialism in one country. It's really Stalinism. It's a Stalinist conception. It's a 20th century perversion of Marxism that gives rise to this idea of national capitalism as a projection of national socialism, of socialism in one country. And of course, when we think of globalization, the discontents with globalization is really a discontent with global capitalism starting in the 1990s after the end of the Cold War. So the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union and of the Warsaw Pact, the Eastern European allies of the Soviet Union, but also of Yugoslavia. There is this idea that now there's unchecked global capitalism, and so you have globalization. But I think that that's tendentious and inaccurate and very misleading on substance, So I don't think that, it's ever been national capitalism. So the question is the political order, the political management of capitalism through nation states. And that political management of capitalism through nation states is never really purely nationalistic or even primarily nationalistic, meaning it's always a matter of negotiation between nation states in a political order. So, of course, Donald Trump and his whole complaint about China, it's not about the United States versus China. It's about how the US and China as political states co-manage capitalism. Because of course the United States and China and the United States and the EU and the EU and China are very much dependent on one another. And so it's not about this capitalism and that capitalism so much as it's about capitalism and what's the political order of that capitalism through the relations of these nation states. I think that's the reality. And in that respect, of course, the struggle for socialism remains the same, meaning the struggle for socialism is a struggle against the political order of capitalism. And the political order of capitalism of nation states is, of course, the enemy. Going all the way back to the First and Second Internationals, but especially the Second International, the Socialist International, it saw itself, it understood itself. And I don't think this was just a fine idea or a kind of utopian ideal. The Second International saw itself as a world government in waiting, meaning Congresses of the Socialist International, of the Second International, convened as the government in waiting for the global dictatorship of the proletariat. Insofar as that global socialist government in waiting was organized into national parties, it was only because in any particular place, you have to deal with the political conditions of a given nation state. But not because the movement was national. The movement was never national. The movement became nationalized as a function of Stalinism in the 20th century. Before that, it did not understand itself as a series of national movements with some distant alliance among each other. No. It was a global movement of the working class. The working class has no country. Working class has no country. And that was real, by the way. The working class before World War I was quite migratory. Quite migratory. The working class today is quite migratory. And it was very common for workers to participate as members of socialist parties in multiple countries. So Russian socialists lived and worked in the United States and participated in the Socialist Party of America, and vice versa. American socialist workers also lived and worked abroad and participated in sister parties in the Socialist International and other countries. That, of course, hardly exists anymore. Right? The internationalism that exists now is purely dependent on international capital. But there was once an actual international socialist and indeed world global socialist, cosmopolitan socialist movement that saw the system of nation states as the political opponent and not as the basis for capitalism. Certainly not the basis for socialism.
So Chris, we're running out of time, and I'd say we have kind of two questions left. So one is about the difference between progressivism circa 1912 and circa 1932. The other is about the contemporary Democrats. Would you like to take both, or would you prefer to take one?
You mean contemporary back then Democrats?
No, today.
Today.
Not, present day Democrats. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe I'll take up that one and try to address the other questions in the mix. So I wrote my Gilded Age article to clarify this question, because I observed with the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2015, 2016, that socialism was being conflated with progressive capitalism. We could just call it progressive capitalism. We could also call it progressive liberalism, but I know that on the left you're supposed to say you're not a liberal or whatever, but really the left is just progressive liberal. That's what they are. As I like to say, the left in the United States are Democrats, nothing but Democrats. So what's the history of that? What is the history of that? And that clarification, therefore, of the difference between a Debs and a Bernie Sanders, that is not simply a matter of one's positions or policies, right? It's not a matter of that. It's also not simply a matter of running for the Democratic Party nomination versus running independently. Because if Bernie Sanders ran with the same program but independently of the Democrats, he would still just be a progressive liberal Democrat. He would just be a progressive liberal Democrat, not in the Democratic Party. So he'd be like the Green Party. So that distinction is extremely important because it gets to the heart of what we mean by socialism. It also turns out to get at the heart of what we mean by capitalism and capitalist politics, meaning there's a conflation in our era of neoliberalism and capitalism. So the idea is that neoliberalism is capitalist politics, but somehow the welfare state is not. Right? Somehow welfare state reform capitalism is not really capitalism. Right? So it's somehow socialism, or if it's not itself socialism, it's a step towards socialism. It's some kind of ingredient of socialism. And that necessitated going back to the earlier history and the earlier, much earlier, historic Marxist socialist opposition to the welfare state, opposition to the welfare state. So, for instance, in 1932, when FDR was running for president and was offering the New Deal, that's his platform, and then began implementing it when he won the election and came into office in 1933, the Socialist Party of America, the old Socialist Party of America that had been represented by Eugene Debs, opposed FDR's New Deal. And the Communist Party of the USA, and this is something that will be taken up later by Reed Cottless in the next lecture, on the legacy of the American Revolution in 20th century American socialism and communism. The Communist Party USA called Roosevelt a fascist, called him a fascist. Now, you can scoff at that, you can dismiss it, but that wasn't mere rhetoric. That's what they really believed. So both the Socialist Party of America and the Communist Party USA were opposed to FDR's welfare state as fascism, as Bonapartism, as state capitalism, as anti-socialism. It's anti-socialism, anti-socialism. Now, as it turned out, the Socialist Party maintained more of a principled opposition to the welfare state, whereas the Communist Party in its Stalinism, out of alliance with progressive liberals, dropped their criticism of the welfare state. And the welfare state became understood instead as a kind of step towards towards socialism. So progressive capitalism is a step towards socialism, as opposed to an anti-socialist measure that demobilizes the working class and turns the working class into a dependent class on the state and on the state's ruling capitalist parties. Because that's what the welfare state is. It's deeply anti-socialist. So in that respect, of course, it was a lot clearer in 1912 with Theodore Roosevelt running as a progressive against his old Vice President Taft and also against Woodrow Wilson. And also against Eugene Debs as a socialist, who was not so much an electoral threat, but did represent a working class that was recalcitrant and that was not easily integrated into capitalist politics. And again, it was a question of heading off this threat of socialism that Roosevelt understood to be a product of the pathology of capitalism. But as a liberal Democrat, albeit a progressive liberal Democrat, he, of course, didn't think that socialism could work. In other words, he thought that a dictatorship of the proletariat or a working class socialist party taking political power would just wreck society. It would just bring the worst elements of society into a place of political authority, and it would wreck the natural aristocracy and meritocracy, his social Darwinist liberal democratic vision. It would put the wrong people in charge and would therefore wreck society. And it wouldn't work. It wouldn't produce the paradise that socialists promised. So again, today, it's completely different, right? So today, it's kind of like socialism means extreme altruism and charity and compassion, empathy, whereas conservatism means selfish, greedy individualism and kind of antisocial attitudes, and liberals are somewhere in between. So liberals are the altruistic, compassionate, good people who betray the movement because they make too many compromises with the selfish, greedy, antisocial people on the right. Right? That's not the way Eugene Debs, that's not the way socialists, that's not the way Marxists ever understood the political problem. It wasn't about the good people versus the bad people. It wasn't about the exploited and oppressed against the privileged, right, and rapacious. It was never about that. It was about capitalism, its crisis in society and politics, and the possibility and necessity of socialism that arises from that crisis. It wasn't about the rich and the poor. It wasn't about the oppressed and the oppressors. It wasn't about the exploited and the exploiters. It wasn't sentimental, and it wasn't based on altruism or compassion or charity. It was based on society and history and the political tasks that capitalism made manifest. So we made scientific socialism, yes? Not utopian socialism, not Christian socialism, not sentimental socialism. And this is why they thought history was on their side. Because of course they could never believe that we would go on for 100 years more now, living in this self-destructive, pathological society of capitalism. And yet we have. And that's not due to the selfish, rapacious greediness of the rich, privileged, exploiter oppressors. It's due to the failure of the working class to take power. And that's a political question. It's a political task. And it's why we, once in a while, remember the history of Marxism and of old-style Marxist socialism, because we remember occasionally there was a time when people thought differently about this and struggled differently for this and were organized to pursue this in a way that we have not been for 100 years.
Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you everybody for joining us. I just want to flag a couple of things for everybody in the audience. You can find recordings of all of these lectures on our YouTube page. Just search for the Platypus Affiliated Society on YouTube. We have one more lecture and then an event in this series. So next Friday, July 24th at 1 p.m. Central Time, Reed Cottless will be giving a lecture titled The American Communists and the Legacy of the Revolution. Following Friday, July 31st, there will be a panel discussion with the lecturers entitled The Fate of the American Revolution? ? So perhaps some open questions from all of these lectures can be brought to the July 31st meeting, also at 1 p.m. Central Time. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Chris.
Thanks.